Thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and it's very helpful that Maria went first because she's already addressed, I think, some of the key points of how memory has developed within Russia and some of the institutionalizations that has taken place in the Russian Federation through law, through cultural initiatives, through control of the educational curriculum. And what I want to emphasize is that all of that has a foreign policy dimension, which is particularly evident if you look at the 2023 foreign policy concept that the Russian Federation released. In there, the country's leaders speak about the protection of the historical truth globally and to protect Russian compatriots from disinformation about history. And it's, I think, really worth taking the time to read that document in detail because we get a better understanding of the mindset through which the leaders of the Russian Federation approach the topic of the falsification of history that is taking place across the globe from the Kremlin's perspective. And one point I want to emphasize, because it links so nicely with the title of the panel today, is the emphasis on Russia's role in decolonization. It's something that, if we look at Europe, is not particularly relevant, but if you look at African discourses about Russian history and about how the war in Ukraine unfolds, this emphasis on decolonization is extremely successful. And that's the first point I would like to emphasize, because it speaks to the failure of the West to address those countries in the global South and to offer them a viable alternative to what the West thinks is the right way forward. And what Russia can do is to reconnect with the Soviet tradition of anti-imperialist commitment, which still seems very credible to leaders of nations where France has withdrawn over the last couple of years, leaving an enormous void. And I think that is important also for the context of the war in Ukraine, because it's a question of global authority and what the global thinking is about what the appropriate action is in Ukraine. And that very closely links to a revision of Cold War history that we are seeing particularly addressed at countries in the global South. So what Russia is doing is basically telling a history of Western interventionism that stretches from Afghanistan to Iran to Kosovo, to Iraq, to Kosovo and to Ukraine, and thereby turning around who is actually guilty of the war in Ukraine, and by embedding it in a global history that can be extremely well communicated to audiences further away than Europe. So I think, first point, we have to look beyond the immediate neighborhood to understand the global battle for solidarity and for what is seen as being the right interpretation of history. And the point for me is it's partially also the failure of the West to offer an alternative and to also be credible about its historical narratives in our own countries. And that's my second point. So Germany, also in the title, is of course a particularly attractive target for Russian memory initiatives. Potentially, there's something like 4 to 5 million compatriots. Lavrov would speak about 6 million Russians. Of course, these are not Russians, but that would be the language that comes from the foreign ministry, who would be potentially loyal to interpretations of history that align with the Kremlin's view. And I think the emphasis on Germany is really important because it's quite a fascinating case of transnational memory, given how the histories between the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union, and Tsarist Russia and Germany have developed over the centuries. And we have an ERC project, which I'm leading at ZOiS, and together with my postdoc, Jakob Matevosyan, and a PhD student, Sophia Winkler, we did quite a lot of work investigating the targets of memory politics coming from Russia. We did, on the one hand, a survey among Russians in Germany, first and second generation Russian migrants and their attitudes on history. And we also did quite a number of in-depth interviews. And I want to just very briefly kind of share a few of the highlights, and we can go into detail as part of the discussion. So the first thing that comes from the survey, where we interviewed 500 people with a migration background from Russia and around 1,600 people without such a background living in Germany, to have a comparison. Is it actually that Russians look differently at history, or do they just share some of the kind of grievances that people have in East Germany, for instance, and have very similar attitudes about history? And the first point that kind of we looked at in greater detail is associations with World War II, since that is the kind of sacred element of Russian history these days. We see a couple of important differences that I would like to emphasize where the Russian memory initiatives don't travel into the German memory culture. The one is the emphasis on victims, which people who live in Germany and have a Russian migration background would mention first. That goes pretty much, or is in certain tension to how Russia would like to think about World War II memory. Nevertheless, especially among the older ones, 50 plus, 55 plus, no offense to anyone in the room, We see that this emphasis on sacred memory, however, the sacred victory that needs to be defended, has a certain popularity. It's a sanitized view on the victory that prevails among the elders, but the research that we did is intergenerational, so we've got a parent and a child. The parents who share these very sanitized views on history are not particularly successful at transmitting that to their children. So we see that the counter discourses on memory that are being created through the German educational system, for instance, manage to kind of suggest counter narratives. However, what is important, we also did kind of modern survey technique experiments. When you prime respondents with the wrong information about World War II history, they become much less supportive of Ukraine, be it weapon deliveries, be it sanctions on Russia, be it Ukraine continuing to fight. So history clearly links with political attitudes, especially among those with a migration background from Russia, if you provide them the right or wrong kind of history. Okay, then let me go to the in-depth interviews very quickly. We've got a few more elements on the surveys, but I know that we are very short on time. So on the in-depth interviews where we spoke with 20 people who have more recently left Russia and 20 people who were socialized in Germany to understand to what extent those two groups differ. And what we did in the interviews, because we're interested in social media and the co-creation of history that challenges Western norms of remembering, how that co-creation of history that takes place through influencers, through history channels, through history documentation that you find on social media, how people relate to that. So we exposed people always to two opposing views on a historical event, such as World War II, and then had a discussion with them about how they respond to these videos, which version they find more convincing. And I think I've mentioned that term a couple of times now. For me, that's really important to think about that spread of Russian memory culture. Very often it's about co-creation. It's not that Russia manages to just control people's brains and hearts, but very often there's a bottom-up dynamic that is part of it. And you can see that in social media, where these initiatives also speak to people, or they're being done by people who hold different kind of grievances in relation to political developments, and who then find an emotional and cultural home in Russia. So the point here, maybe kind of for everyone to take away what comes out in these interviews is that the more distant the event is that we are talking about and that we trigger people with, the more distant the event of the video is, the more likely emotional appropriations of the historical event are to make a difference for their attitudes. So in other words, when there's no lived experience of the event, when there's no credible grandma to talk about it any longer, when the family, in the extended family, is still in Russia and I as a Russian am in Germany only with my nuclear family, in those cases, emotional propagandistic narratives that string a chord with the Russian version of the event are very successful. These people kind of reiterate them and also start to be very defensive about such historical lessons. And I think that to a certain extent is maybe less surprising, because this distance, and we know this from the integration literature on migration in general, the distance to the homeland increases the longing for the homeland. So the second generation is much more likely to embrace propagandistic narratives about World War II and also to be very frustrated about how the war, the Second World War, is being narrated here in Germany. The first generation, so those who more recently left Russia, of course, left for a good reason. They are more likely to be critical, although not all of them. They would reject the instrumentalization of the sacred victory for present-day political abuse, but what they would defend is a culturalist version of Russia. So they would still say, well, but our gender equality is much more advanced than yours in Germany. I'm in Germany now and I feel like I'm in the 60s in the Soviet Union. So there's a sense of certain Russian cultural values which they would still position on top of that what they experience in the West, even though they reject the institutionalization of history as it takes place in the Russian Federation today. Okay, so these are two snippets of what we did in the ERC project. I'll very briefly return to the kind of larger question of the panel this morning. And the question, well, do authoritarian regimes learn from Russia? And I think the answer is very clearly yes. You can see that with China, you can see that with Turkey most clearly, and you can see that in the success that Russia has with its memory initiatives. And I think the success is ever stronger because democracies, in the way they engage with history, provide a very challenging starting point. I mean, history as an exercise of self-critical reflection of a nation's wrongdoings is not particularly attractive for many people. And we see that, especially in Germany, in the voting behavior, not only in the east of Germany, should be said, but particularly in the east, of course, where young men vote especially for a party on the far right that challenges prevailing historical narratives, and young women vote for a party on the extreme left, which challenges the norms of remembering. So democracies provide a very weak offer at the moment, making it much easier for authoritarian regimes to spread versions of history among their diaspora. And if you kind of broaden the geographical scope, a case that we look at a little bit, or quite a bit, is Canada, where Chinese historical initiatives are absolutely central to how Canadian memory evolves. In Germany, the Turkish community, of course, is of importance itself. The second point, I think, is that much of the kind of centers of gravity in how the European Union loves to remember its European history of World War II is receding ever more in the distant past. People have ever less knowledge about it, and in a Europe that has become much more diverse than in the 70s and 80s, the moral imperative of World War II is just no longer traveling, especially to young people. So the alternative that is being offered from an agent such as the Kremlin is very attractive, and especially China and Turkey are looking at it and see the cultural influence as a huge resource to have impact on populations across the globe and simply to destabilize democracies. Thank you
so much, Felix. Yes. Yeah, that was another highly interesting presentation, and I was personally very interested to learn about the results of the study you did, and I very much hope many people here in the audience and also online audience would be interested in reading more about it. I suggest you can find it on your website, right?
Yes, you can find it on my website.
Yeah, you can find. I have plenty of questions, but since I have to restrain myself as well, I'll probably just ask one for now, and it's more a question about understanding. So when you speak about this, people with Russian background in Germany, what was your composition roughly? So say you say 30% descendants of Spätaussiedlers, late, what do you call them in English? People who came...
Resettlers.
Resettlers.
Yeah, late resettlers.
30% those who came in the last, 5 years, 30% someone else. So how would you differentiate between all these groups?
So in the survey that we did, everyone who was part of that survey was socialized or had so the parental generation, it's a bit complicated. So we have a parental generation who underwent their socialization in the Russian Federation or in the kind of Russian part of the Soviet Union, because that creates a certain kind of condition. If you leave that part of the Soviet Union and come to Germany, you are often considered, you're more likely to be considered a Russian, or you have a biographical link at least to today's Russia. So these parents finished socialization in Russia, full exposure to the authoritarianism back home. Left Russia after they turned 18. That's the kind of measurement, operationalization, because you need a date to select people into or outside of the sample. And then everyone who is part of the survey has a child who is older than 18 and was him or herself socialized in Germany in order to be able for us, that's the kind of scientific interest, to take apart the influence of the family and of the institutions where the child grew up, and the peers and media and all things that matter on your political and social attitudes over life. And for primarily ethical reasons, the child was also 18, so had finished socialization in Germany, which means the parent was 39 plus, therefore left the Russian Federation throughout the 1990s or Soviet Russia in the 1980s. A quarter self-identify as late resettlers, and everyone else has kind of different migration trajectories. And I think that's for the survey.
Okay. Thank you so much.